Hi, this is Law Now. Welcome back to our riveting journey through Indian constitutional history, where each episode unfolds a new chapter in the saga of governance and resistance. Today, we delve deeper into the transformative acts that reshaped India's colonial narrative and also how and why the Indian National Congress was born. Now imagine the year 1784. A pivotal moment in history when the Pitt's India Act turned the tide of India's governance, setting the stage for a dual governance that echoed with intentions and complexities. The Act aimed to establish a double government, but it failed to achieve its objectives. The British Company ruling India, known as the East India Company, became increasingly irresponsible and complicated. Even the Board of Control, which was supposed to oversee the company's affairs, couldn't effectively control its actions. Reflecting on this era, Adam Smith, in his seminal work The Wealth of Nations, written in 1776, astutely remarked, and I quote, "Such exclusive companies, therefore, are nuisances in every respect, always more or less inconvenient to the countries in which they are established, and destructive to those which have the misfortune to fall under their government." Now the situation worsened when the Indian Rebellion of 1857, often called the First War of Independence, struck a severe blow to the company's rule. As a result, the British Parliament passed the Government of India Act in 1858. This act transferred the governance of India from the East India Company to the British Crown. India would now be ruled in the name of the reigning monarch, which at that time was Queen Victoria. The act abolished the Board of Control and the Court of Directors, transferring their powers to the Secretary of State for India, who was appointed by the Crown. Assisting the Secretary of State was a council, called the Council of India, consisting of 15 members. 8 members were appointed by the Crown, while the remaining 7 were elected by the Court of Directors, and the Secretary of State served as the Council's chairman. The Act also mandated the Secretary of State to provide an annual account of India's revenue and also submit a report on the country's progress to the British Parliament. Additionally, the Law Member and the Advocate General, who served the Governor General in Council of India, were to be appointed directly by the British monarch. The Indian Council Act of 1861 marked another significant milestone. It introduced representative institutions in India and established the framework of government that lasted for many years to come. And for the first time, Indians were involved in the legislative process. Under this act, the Legislative Council of the Governor General was expanded to include additional members, with half of them being non-official members. The Legislative Council gained the power to create laws and regulations for various aspects of governance, both within and outside British India. The Act also restored the legislative powers to the presidency governments of Bombay and Madras. The provincial legislative councils were empowered to make laws for their respective provinces, subject to the Governor-General's assent. The Governor-General had the authority to veto bills and issue ordinances. He could also modify the boundaries of provinces, presidencies, and territories. However, the provincial legislatures couldn't pass any laws that contradicted the acts of the central legislature. The Indian Council Act of 1861 holds significance for 2 main reasons. Firstly, it allowed the Governor-General to involve the people in the legislative process, marking a step towards greater participation. And secondly, by granting legislative powers to the Bombay and Madras governments, It laid the foundation for the policy of legislative devolution, which eventually led to the significant autonomy for the provinces in 1937. So basically, the Pitt's India Act, the Government of India Act of 1858, and the Indian Council Act of 1861 shaped India's governance during the colonial era, with each act introducing changes and reforms in the administration of the country. These acts reflect the evolving relationship between India and the British Crown, as well as the gradual inclusion of Indians in the decision-making process. Now we come to the birth of the Indian National Congress. It was established in the year 1885. Imagine the air thick with anticipation as the first annual session of the Congress unfolded. They had demands from the British government which would shape the future of India and its independence movement. What were these demands? Well, firstly, they asked for civil rights. The leaders of the Congress understood the importance of freedom. They demanded the fundamental rights of freedom of speech and press, the right to organize processions and meetings. They were determined to break free from the chains of suppression and let their voices be heard like a chorus of passion and determination. Next was the administrative realm. The Congress leaders were like bold warriors ready to battle against administrative abuses. They wanted the government to wipe away these abuses. They insisted on Indians being appointed in the government services, claiming their rightful place on the chessboard of governance. Additionally, they championed public welfare measures, advocating for the common man's upliftment amidst the colonial rule. Next were the constitutional demands of the early Congress leaders. Picture them as the architects of change, constructing a grand edifice of constitutional reform. They dreamt of legislative councils with increased power, like majestic fortresses of democratic representation. They yearned for elected Indian representatives to join the ranks like new stars twinkling in the political constellation. But alas, the British government turned a deaf ear to these humble demands, like an oblivious ruler unwilling to listen to the cries of its subjects. Last but not the least, we venture into the economic arena. The Congress held the British economic policies accountable. They decreed rising property prices and economic issues plaguing the Indian people to the economic policies of the British. The Congress proposed innovative solutions to boost the country's economic well-being. They envisioned a world of modern industries emerging. They called for the Indianization of public services, like a rallying cry for national pride. And oh, how they demanded the abolition of the salt tax, like a plea to quench the thirst of the poorest among us. So my friends, let us marvel at the audacity, the determination, and the vision of the early Congress leaders. They were the architects of change, the warriors of freedom, and the champions of justice. Their resolutions reverberated through history, shaping the course of a nation's destiny. As we journey forward, we encounter the Indian Councils Act of 1892, a beacon of incremental change amidst the colonial narrative. The Indian Council Act of 1892 brought about three important changes. It increased the number of members in the central and provincial councils, introduced a partial election system, and expanded the functions of the councils. The Governor-General's Council had a minimum of 10 and a maximum of 16 members. The Act allowed for additional members with a fixed number for Bombay, Bengal, and Madras. The provincial councils, including those of the northwestern provinces and Oudh, had limited powers to ask questions from the government. But the council president could disallow questions without providing a reason. While the Act laid down the foundation for representative government, it had its flaws, like every other act before it. The election system introduced was faulty, as it did not truly represent the people of India. Certain classes were overrepresented while others had no representation at all. For example, Bombay Council allotted 6 seats to European merchants but none to Indian merchants. Furthermore, the power of the legislative councils were limited, as members had no right to ask questions on budget and the number of non-official members were very small. Although the Act of 1892 fell short of the Indian National Congress's demand, it marked significant progress compared to the existing state of affairs. It paved the way for future advancements by acknowledging the principles of elections and granting the legislative councils some control over the executive, both at the central and provincial levels. Now we come to the year 1909. The Indian Councils Act of 1909, also known as the Morley-Minto Reforms, was a significant change in Indian governance. Named after Morley, who was the Secretary of State, and Minto, who was the Viceroy. This reform aimed to make the legislative process more inclusive. It significantly increased the number of members in the legislative councils at both the central and provincial levels. For instance, the members in the Governor-General's Council were increased from 16 to 60. These changes were little steps towards involving more Indian representatives in the decision-making process. The Act of 1909 also expanded the powers of the Legislative Council. They were now authorized to discuss any matter, ask questions, and present supplementary inquiries. The councils were given the right to debate and propose resolutions on financial statements, although they were not yet granted the power to vote. Now, the Act of 1909, while imperfect, was a stepping stone towards a more inclusive and representative system, igniting a spark that would eventually blaze into India's quest for complete self-governance, Purn Swaraj. Nevertheless, it marked progress by granting greater participation and influence to the legislative councils in shaping the governance of India. And that concludes part 4 of our journey through India's constitutional history. But the story doesn't end here, my friends. There's much more to uncover and discuss in part 5. If you're captivated by these intricate tales of law and justice and the history of our constitution, make sure to hit the subscribe button, stay curious and ready for deeper dives in our next video. Until then, thank you for watching.